He slammed her into the wall like the Constitution was optional. But what if the woman he cuffed wasn't the problem? She was the reckoning. He didn't ask who she was, he just assumed she didn't matter, and that was his first mistake. What happened next was not only a lesson for the aggressors, but also a powerful reminder of empathy, responsibility, and the ongoing fight for equal dignity. We're about to share a powerful moment of truth, but first, drop your location and let us know, have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. Grant Ellison's jaw flexed as he clicked the cuffs shut, loud like punctuation, a statement, not a restraint. He didn't bark Miranda. He didn't need to. His uniform did the talking, and in this courthouse it spoke fluent intimidation. He was tall, built like a bulldozer with a grudge, and he moved like a man who'd never once been corrected. His eyes scanned the room the way a spotlight scans a yard for trespassers, searching for guilt, not truth. He saw a quiet black woman by the benches and decided that calm must mean threat, that posture must mean defiance, that stillness must mean she's hiding something. But mostly, he saw someone who didn't shrink when he stared her down. And Grant hated when people didn't shrink. She hadn't said a word, not when he demanded ID, not when he snatched her bag, not when his hand wrapped around her wrist and yanked her forward like she'd reached into his holster, not even when her face hit the wall, not even then. She just stood there, body tense, breath shallow, cheek against paint, the metal biting her skin, and her eyes. When she turned her head slowly, deliberately, they didn't flare with fear. They didn't plead. They didn't apologize. They measured him, quietly, precisely, as if cataloging the temperature of his rage, the speed of his pulse, the gap between law and performance. It was the kind of look you only give someone when you've been through worse and survived it. She didn't scream. She didn't demand a supervisor. She didn't say, "You don't know who I am." And that silence, that was what shook the air. Because it wasn't weakness, it wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She stood there, cuffed and calculating, and somewhere behind the stillness you could hear the faint ticking of someone who came prepared. She let him play his role, the enforcer, the protector, the one who decides who gets to walk freely through marble halls. And she let the onlookers play theirs too, the passive audience, the just watch crew, the silent validation machine that makes injustice feel like policy. They didn't even realize they were part of the script, but she did. There's a kind of injustice that stings like a slap, and there's the kind that crawls inside you and builds a nest. This wasn't an outburst. It was a system flexing its spine. This wasn't an officer out of control. It was control itself, misused and mistaken for order. He cuffed her like a man planting a flag, but he never stopped to ask what ground he'd just claimed. And that's where the story changes. Because this woman, she didn't come here to be a statistic or a headline or a court date. She came to watch, to observe, to measure how justice breathes in real time, and she just let that breath get held long enough for the truth to take shape. The cameras were rolling, not just the phones in the crowd, but the ones in the ceiling, in the corners, in the eyes of every person who would later say, "Yeah, I saw it," and still did nothing. Because here's the thing, justice isn't blind. Sometimes it's just looking the other way, afraid that meeting your gaze might demand action. Grant thought he'd finished the scene. Badge displayed, suspect subdued, control reaffirmed, but all he'd done was mark the moment. He didn't know who she was, not yet, but he would, and when he found out, it wouldn't be with a bang. It would be with a realization that echoed a little too late, that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't his courtroom. Maybe justice had already shown up and it wore flats, carried a tote bag, and knew exactly how to dismantle a system, quietly. And as he stood there, chest puffed, expecting fear, expecting submission, she just looked at him, measured him again, not with anger, not with panic, but with the kind of calm that says, "You just wrote your own ending, and I'm the one holding the pen." She hadn't said a single word, but somehow she'd said everything. The courthouse wasn't built for comfort. It was built for control. Cold air spilled from the vents like a warning, not a luxury. Marble floors gleamed with indifference, and the benches, straight-backed, unforgiving, were made to remind you that this wasn't a place for rest. It was a place for reckoning. But only for the poor, the powerless, or the people who didn't speak the same language as the badge. Even the light felt artificial. It buzzed from the ceiling like it had better things to do, casting long shadows and short patience. The walls weren't beige by accident. They were painted to erase mood, mute emotion, scrub out anything that looked like individuality. Even grief got filtered here, even rage had to whisper. Grant Ellison thrived in places like this. He moved through it like it belonged to him, like the courthouse was his living room and the badge was the deed. He didn't walk. He patrolled. His boots struck the tile with the rhythm of a metronome set to comply or else. He didn't wait for cues from a judge or nods from a clerk. He didn't need a reason to act. He was the reason, the filter, the line between order and chaos, at least in his mind. To Grant, his job wasn't just enforcement, it was evaluation, not just keep peace, but decide who deserves to feel safe. And safe, in his book, looked a lot like him. The way he handled people wasn't about protocol, it was about posture. He judged voices, stares, hoodies, hesitation. He thought if someone asked why, they were challenging his command. If someone hesitated, they were hiding something. And if someone like her, like Nen, stood still and calm after being slammed into a wall, well, that was a problem too. She didn't respond the way Grant was trained to expect. No tears, no trembling, not even an angry shout. Just presence. Quiet, calculated presence. Like she was noting every detail, timing every breath, building something invisible behind her eyes. And that's what got under his skin the most. Because he couldn't figure her out, couldn't place her, couldn't feel her fear. Grant had built his entire rhythm around reading people's reactions. He knew what scared looks sounded like. He knew the difference between defiance and desperation. But this woman, she didn't give him anything to measure. That silence wasn't passive. It was active, and it pressed against him harder than the weight of his own vest. His badge said authority, but something about her stillness whispered, "You're not the one in control here." Grant didn't know her name, not yet, didn't know where she came from or why she was there. All he knew was that she had looked at him without flinching, like she had seen 100 men just like him and filed them into categories. And he hated that. Hated the feeling of being sized up, written down and dismissed without a single word. He tried to shake it off, tried to convince himself she was just another courthouse loiterer, another watcher, another problem waiting to be escorted out the side door, but something about that moment refused to leave him. So he did what men like Grant do. He returned to his post. Just outside Courtroom 3, arms folded, eyes scanning, pretending nothing had happened, pretending she hadn't looked through him like she already knew how his story ended. The hallway buzzed back to life. Clerks returned to typing. Lawyers whispered into phone calls. The crowd shifted, murmured, resumed its silent choreography. But one thing was different now. One piece didn't fall back into place. And it was him. He couldn't stop replaying her face, couldn't stop wondering what it meant. Why she didn't yell, why she didn't fight, why the silence didn't feel like surrender, it felt like surveillance. He glanced toward the bench where she had sat. Empty now? No sign of her? No file in her hand, no badge on display, just absence. And a pressure in the air that hadn't been there before. It wrapped around his shoulders, tighter than his uniform. Because deep down, He could feel it. Something was off scrim, something was out of sync, and she was behind it. He didn't know her name, but he would. He didn't know her purpose, but it was already underway, and for the first time in a long while, Grant Ellison felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Out. The hallway had settled back into its regular hum. Documents shuffled, heels clicked, the soft murmur of legal deals and human desperation filling the air like background static. Grant stood exactly where he had been before, arms folded, jaw tight, a century of self-importance. His hand still tingled from earlier, a phantom echo of when he slammed her against the wall. That moment had started to feel like a distant thunderclap he didn't fully understand, but couldn't stop replaying. She was gone, he assumed. Out of the building, out of sight, done, problem neutralized. Then she stood. Not fast, not with a flourish, just deliberate. Like someone finishing a breath they started an hour ago, like someone choosing the exact second to return gravity to the room. She didn't demand attention, but she took it. Without moving more than a few feet, without raising her voice, she shifted the temperature in that hallway, and for a brief second nobody noticed. But when she reached into her bag, the motion so calm, so casual, the air tightened again. Grant watched her, confused. He braced for a complaint, another accusation, maybe even a lawyer's card. But what came next wasn't complaint. It was correction. She flipped open a leather wallet, and there it was. A gold badge. Police Blue. Her name glinting in silver beneath the emblem like a quiet bell ringing in everyone's spine. Chief Nain Monroe, District 12. And the world, for just a breath, forgot how to move. The sound of the courthouse dimmed as though someone had turned down the volume on everything except her. The hallway, which once bent to Grant's bark, now bent to her presence. Eyes widened. A clerk behind the desk gasped, the kind of gasp that doesn't escape often in places like this. Down the corridor someone dropped a pen. It clicked against tile, a sound too loud for its size. Even the judge inside the courtroom 3B paused mid-sentence, the silence bleeding through the thick wooden doors. There are moments when power doesn't have to announce itself. It just enters the room and everything else steps back. This was one of those moments. Nain didn't look at the crowd. She looked at Grant, not with anger, not with vengeance, with knowledge, with calculation, with the precise weight of someone who had already seen the ending and had chosen this moment to begin it. And when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It cut. "I was sworn in yesterday," she said, steady as stone, "and I came here today to see how justice is applied in this building. That was all. No shout, no rebuke, no demand, but the words landed like thunder anyway." Grant opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His body stiffened. The radio on his chest suddenly felt like a spotlight. The cuffs on his belt? Useless now. His authority, which had once been loud, was now shrinking under the weight of her composure. He was trained to control a scene, not to lose one. And this wasn't in the manual. He'd cuffed her, slammed her, silenced her in front of a crowd, and now she stood with the kind of stillness that made people question everything they thought they knew. He had used force. She used truth. He had barked commands. She had waited. And now? She'd delivered her line like a verdict. No one moved. No one breathed. Grant felt every eye in that hallway shift, away from her and toward him. They weren't just watching. They were reevaluating, recalculating, witnessing. And in that frozen moment, it was clear. Justice hadn't shouted. It hadn't kicked in a door or drawn a weapon. It had walked in wearing a blouse, carried a bag, and waited quietly for the right moment to be seen. Nain lowered her badge slowly, deliberately. She didn't have to say more. She had already said enough. What she offered wasn't just proof of authority. It was a mirror. And Grant, standing there with his fists clenched and his rank shrinking, had to stare into it and see what everyone else now saw. Not a protector, but a liability. Not a man upholding justice, but a man who'd confused his authority with righteousness. She turned without a word, leaving him rooted, the cuffs still jingling at his side, now heavy with meaning. The hallway didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't tension anymore. It was truth. Thick, undeniable, and echoing in every breathless corner of the building. The shift had happened, the power had changed hands, and all she had to do was stand. Because he used cuffs, she used clarity, and while Grant's authority had relied on fear, Neen's was built on something far more dangerous to people like him: legitimacy. The first time Nine stood on those courthouse steps, she wasn't a chief. She wasn't even close. She was 17, wearing a borrowed blouse and a skirt that brushed against her ankles, standing beside her mother with a folder full of forms and too much hope for a Tuesday. They had taken 2 buses to get there. One broke down halfway, the other reeked of diesel and old chewing gum. But they made it, just barely. Her mother's hand gripped hers tightly, the way mothers do when they've survived enough to know things can turn on a dime. And that's exactly what happened. The female officer at the entrance didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. One glance, one sweep of the eyes, and the verdict was delivered. You can't come in here dressed like that. No policy, no citation, just judgment, thinly veiled as protocol. Her mother didn't argue, didn't ask to speak to anyone. She just turned, pressing Naeen's hand gently, like trying to protect her from the shame that was already settling in. They left without saying a word. No one followed. No one objected. The world around them moved on like nothing had happened. And that's when Naeen first learned that silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. It was the sound of permission. It was the sound of people saying, "Not my problem." That night, her mother sat at the kitchen table, scribbling something on a sheet of lined paper. She didn't say much, just wrote. Folded it once, twice, then again. 4 neat squares, corners sharp. "You don't have to understand it now," she said, slipping it into Naeen's hand. "But keep it close." The letter was short, just 1 sentence in faded blue ink. "Justice doesn't wear a badge, it walks in your spine." Nan didn't ask what it meant then. She just tucked it away, the way people carry photos of those who taught them how to endure. Years later, after her mother passed, Naeen found herself standing in front of the police academy gates, hair pulled back, sneakers worn thin, breath tight in her chest. She had made it through the paperwork, the background check, the tests. She was fast, sharp, controlled. She never missed a shot. But control, as she quickly learned, wasn't always enough. During a training session, one of the instructors made a joke at the expense of another black recruit. Something about speech patterns and street slang. It wasn't even clever, just cruel, wrapped in confidence. The others laughed. The recruit looked away. Naeen didn't. She filed a report that same day. Not dramatic, just facts, just truth. And a week later, her access badge stopped working. They called it a fit issue, a misalignment of values. They told her she was too reactive, too emotional, not ready for the demands of this career. There was no hearing, no confrontation, just a letter, thin envelope, no apology. And for a moment, she thought about walking away from it all. But that's when she opened the folded note again, the one from her mother. "Justice doesn't wear a badge, it walks in your spine." That sentence didn't need a classroom, it didn't need validation, it just needed someone who wouldn't fold. So Naeen got quiet. She studied harder. She reapplied. She passed every written exam again, every obstacle course. She kept her head down, but her eyes wide open. She watched who got promoted and who got pushed out. She watched who laughed too loud in locker rooms and who got silenced in conference rooms. And she learned to carry fire the way her mother had, quietly, constantly. The letter lives in her wallet now. Still folded in those same 4 squares, papers softened by time, corners rounded from years of travel. It sits directly behind her badge, not in front of it, not below it, but right behind it. A spine for the shield. A reminder that authority isn't power unless it stands for something more than itself. People assume she carries herself like a chief because of her title, but they don't know that everything she does is measured against that one sentence from a kitchen table in a too small apartment with too big dreams. And this morning, as she sat in her car across from the same courthouse steps where that officer once blocked their way, she sipped her coffee slowly. The bitterness was familiar, not bitter like resentment, bitter like clarity, like resolve. The street was quiet. The sun hadn't crested over the roofline yet, and as the warmth filled her chest, it didn't feel like caffeine. It felt like purpose. She adjusted her blazer, tucked the letter back into place, and stepped out. No press, no crowd, just breath and spine, and a nameplate that didn't need to be spoken to carry weight. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there for memory, for reckoning, for the girl who wasn't allowed in, for the woman who was never meant to leave. Her silence wasn't a pause, it was a countdown, and now the timer had reached 0. The room was small, square, windowless, just beige walls and a hum from the ceiling vent that filled the silence like it was trying to be helpful. No cameras, no flags, no press, just a table, 2 chairs, and the kind of quiet that strips away excuses. Grant Ellison sat stiff, arms crossed, eyes fixed on a spot somewhere over Nadine Monroe's shoulder. He didn't speak, not yet. Maybe he thought silence would give him back some control. Maybe he thought if he said nothing, he couldn't say the wrong thing. But the moment she stepped in and closed the door behind her, he already knew. This wasn't a meeting. This was the reckoning. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she laid a folder on the table between them. It landed with a soft, deliberate sound, paper and weight and truth. The red tab on the corner was already curled like it had been opened too many times, like it had waited years to be acknowledged. She said nothing, she just opened it, one page after another sliding out like puzzle pieces that had been hidden in drawers, shuffled by hands that thought they were safe in shadow, screenshots of internal memos, filed but never followed up, statements from officers whose names had once been redacted, incident reports that began and ended with Grant's name, but somehow never reached a formal complaint. He leaned forward, picked up one sheet, scanned it with narrowed eyes, then tossed it back down. "This is nonsense," he muttered, already shaking his head. "You brought me in here to humiliate me?" His voice had the edge of a man trying to sound confident but failing to find the ground beneath his own feet. "You really think you're going to erase my entire career over a couple of misunderstandings and some bitter rookies with chips on their shoulders?" She finally sat, calm, steady. She looked at him like a surgeon looks at an X-ray, clinical but not unfeeling. "I'm not erasing your career," she said. "You did that yourself." Her voice didn't rise, it didn't accuse, it documented. She pushed another document forward, then another. Witness names, dates, stills from footage. A man cuffed while trying to explain he was a witness, not a suspect. A woman pushed against a patrol car after asking why her son was being questioned without a parent present. A rookie officer, now out of the force, quoted you as saying, "Handle the loud ones early, teaches the rest." Grant scoffed, bitter and loud. "This is personal. That's what this is. You want a headline? You want to play queen for a day and make an example out of me?" She didn't blink. "You humiliated the badge," she said softly. The words didn't slam into him. They didn't shout, but they landed like a final gavel, clear and cold. "That uniform doesn't belong to you," she continued. "It belongs to the people it's supposed to protect. Every time you grabbed someone without cause, every time you laughed in a locker room about how quick you could shut someone down, you weren't upholding order. You were breaking trust." He opened his mouth to fire back, but she cut him off by sliding a small flash drive across the table. No label, just plastic and silence. "That's from the locker room camera," she said. "The one you thought wasn't recording." His hand twitched. "That's you," she continued, telling another officer to cuff a boy before he gets loud. "That's you saying it's better to nip it early than let someone think they have rights you can't control. That's you laughing when an immigrant stutters through a sentence and you say, 'Too slow to talk, too fast to walk free.' The heat that had once radiated off him turned into stillness. His jaw clenched, his fingers pressed against the table like he could push the truth back into place. "You don't understand what it's like out there," he hissed, leaning in. "You come in here with your title and your folder and your speeches, but you don't know what it means to walk those streets and see real threats in real time." Nadine leaned in too, but not with anger. With precision. "I walked those streets," she said. "I walked them when I didn't have a badge, when I was followed in stores, when I was pulled over for going 5 under the limit, when I was questioned for sitting in my own car outside my own apartment. And I still walked into this profession anyway. Not to be safe, but to make it safe for others." He shrank. Not physically, but in posture, in energy, in the subtle tilt of a man who'd just felt the floor give beneath his shoes. His armor wasn't bulletproof. It was paper. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the floor he used to stand on. She stood, slow, with the folder in one hand and the flash drive in the other. She walked to the door, then paused, her back to him. "This isn't about revenge," she said quietly. "It's about reckoning. You built a career on fear, but that only works until people stop being afraid of you." She turned just enough to glance over her shoulder. "You've been the loudest voice in the room for years, Grant. Let's see how you handle silence." And then she left him sitting there, no badge to lean on, no rank to shout behind, just the hum of the vent and the quiet drip of everything he'd once controlled, now slipping through the cracks he'd tried so long to ignore. Grant Ellison returned to work the following Monday expecting resistance. What he wasn't prepared for was indifference. There was no confrontation, no angry crowd, no public shaming, just silence. Thick, deliberate silence. No nods in the hallway, no greetings from the bullpen. People saw him, sure, but their eyes moved past him like rain off glass. He wasn't feared anymore. He wasn't even avoided. He was dismissed. It wasn't punishment, it was absence. The badge still hung on his chest, but it no longer pulled attention. It had lost its gravity. He had become weightless in a room where he used to set the temperature. His inbox didn't ping. His phone didn't buzz. When he reached for the door to the locker room, 2 officers walked out mid-conversation and didn't pause, didn't make space, didn't look up. One of them chuckled at something the other said, a sound so casual it stung. He hadn't heard that kind of laughter in his presence in years, not because it wasn't there, but because he had always occupied too much space for it to exist. Now, the hallway had room again. His name no longer filled it. The email came at 10:03 a.m. Subject line, "Administrative leave, effective immediately. No meeting, no badge collection, no final warning. Just a line in bold, black font and an attachment with his name and badge number typed next to the word inactive." He read it twice, then 3 more times, hoping the meaning would shift if he stared long enough. But it didn't. The department hadn't expelled him. It had let him evaporate. While Grant disappeared, someone else reappeared. Leticia Torres stepped back into the department not with fanfare, but with function. She wasn't reintroduced at a podium or under fluorescent lights. She walked into the morning meeting with a clipboard, nodded at the officers around the table, and sat down like she'd never left. 6 years ago, she'd been quietly removed from tactical command after leading a high-risk negotiation with too much authority, too much composure, too much tone for some to handle. Officially, the paperwork cited concerns about command presence. Everyone knew that was code for she didn't lead like a man. That morning, she returned as deputy lead of field and training reform. She didn't need to be reintroduced. Her presence did that on its own. The department didn't change overnight. There were no slogans on banners, no awkward team-building seminars. Instead, Nadine restructured the morning briefs. Listening replaced lecturing. Cadets were asked questions no one used to care about. How would you handle fear that doesn't look like fear? When was the last time you listened without interruption? Leticia didn't talk tactics the first week. She talked presence, pressure, posture. She told stories. Then she made space for others to tell theirs. One morning, a rookie, young, skin tight with nerves, eyes unsure, stood in front of the training wing waiting for the session to start. His gaze fell on the wooden plaque mounted just above the door. It was hand-lettered, old, protected behind glass. The ink had faded over time, but the words still stood. Justice begins with conscience. He read it aloud, barely a whisper, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, his shoulders straightened, as if the words had shifted something beneath his skin, as if somehow the room itself had grown lighter. And in that moment it was clear. The system hadn't fallen apart. It had turned, not a collapse, but a pivot. Quiet, steady, like a wheel grinding back onto its proper track. No headlines were written that day, no news vans waited outside the building, but inside, officers who had once flinched from their own doubts began asking better questions. That's how change really happens, not with fireworks, but with friction, heat, repetition, and finally forward motion. Nadine didn't need a round of applause. She didn't need a write-up or a pat on the back. She needed that hallway to stop clenching. And it had. Not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to feel like the floor wasn't tilting anymore. She stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon with no one trailing behind. No cameras, no crowd. Just her heels tapping lightly against the steps, and the quiet certainty that today had done something. She paused near the bottom stair, adjusted the strap on her bag, and took one final look at the building behind her. The same courthouse that once turned her mother away now echoed her footsteps with reverence, not resistance. And though no one followed her out, everyone who had seen her walk through those doors that morning stood straighter now, not because she ordered them to, but because something in her silence had spoken louder than 100 speeches. Justice didn't shout that day. It didn't throw punches or demand center stage. It wore flats. It carried folders. It sat when it needed to sit and stood when the time came to rise, and when it walked out, it left behind no footprints. Just better questions and the quiet beginning of an answer. Justice wasn't loud, it just learned how to walk again. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.